Database migrations are used to manage changes to your project's database schema. So far, we have been focusing on the first steps of this process of changing the project's database schema by making model changes and running the make migrations command. The make migrations command prepares a migration, preparing a file which includes all the instructions that Django needs to make the migration, the actual change to the database. Now, we haven't quite finished here with the make migration sections. We will swing back and look at some deeper examples. But in order to get to those deeper examples, we need a little bit more knowledge of some of the other principles and underpinning knowledge so that we can then swing back to make migrations a little bit later in this module. So we're going to move on slightly and now have a look at the migrate command, which is a powerful tool for applying these migrations that we have generated through the make migrations process. Now, I appreciate that even just following along in this course, we have utilized the migrate command multiple times, and you probably are already familiar with the general process of running make migrations and then run the migrate command to actually apply those changes to the database. So although we are probably already familiar with the migrate command, I wanted to spend a little bit of time maybe just formalizing some of the other principles that we probably don't know about the migrate command and maybe get a little bit deeper into the topic. Hopefully, if you have explored all the tutorials up to this point in this module, you have learned a little bit more about the make migrations process. Let's go ahead and make migrations for this project. Now, if you have watched the previous tutorials, we're aware now that we have created the migration files, and we're now ready to go ahead and actually make those changes to the database. So assuming that your project is already connected to a database, then we can go ahead and run the migrate command. So in general terms, the migrate command will execute all the pending migrations and synchronize the database with the current state of our models. We noticed that we used the migrate command without specifying any apps, so it was performed globally. And you can see here that the operations were performed not only to the inventory app here and the stock app, they both have models, but in addition to that, all the other default apps that have been configured in the setting. Similar to the approach we took with the make migrations, where we can specify the app. So if we are working on a particular app, maybe we want to only specify make migrations for an individual app. So in this case, let's go for the stock app. So I've reset everything before we run this. So here I make migrations for a single app. And in addition to that, we can also then run a similar command with migrate so that we only migrate from a single app. So if we want to be more specific with the migration and migrate process, we can, of course, just select the app we want to work with. When you run the migrate command in a Django project, Django does perform important actions to manage your database schema. When we run the migrate command, Django will check for unapplied migrations in our project. So unapplied migrations, these are migrations that have been created but not yet applied to the database. Applying pending migrations involves executing the SQL statements defined in each migration file in sequence. So these SQL statements create, modify, or delete database tables, columns, indexes, and other schema elements to match the changes made in your Django models. Part of the migrate command process is that Django will update the migration records in the database. So Django keeps track of which migrations have been applied to the database by maintaining a record of applied migrations in a special table called Django migrations. After applying each migration, Django updates this table to mark the migration as applied, and we'll take a closer look at the Django migration table in a few tutorials' time. Something that we did stumble upon in a previous tutorial is the fact that Django uses transactions during migrations to help maintain database consistency. So by wrapping a migration operation within a transaction, Django ensures automaticity. This means that if any part of the migration process fails due to syntax errors or database constraint violation or any other issues, all changes made by the migration are rolled back, and the database is then restored to its state before the migration began. So this ultimately prevents partial updates that can leave the database in an inconsistent state. Imagine if we were to perform a migration and only half of it was to be applied. The other half might be still crucial for our application to work, but of course, now we're left in a state where we're trying to work out what has been applied and what hasn't, and we would need to roll back or revert back to where we started from before the migration. So to prevent these type of occurrences, here Django wraps the migration operation within a transaction so that either everything is applied correctly or it fails. So to summarize these steps of the migration process, first, locating migration. So first of all, Django searches for pending migrations in your project, typically under the migrations folder within your app directory. So each migration file represents a specific change made in or to your models. Next step is analyzing migration. So for each pending migration, Django reads its contents and understands the intended schema changes. So this will include information like adding or removing fields, modifying field types, creating or deleting tables, and so on. And then the third step applies the changes. So based upon the analyzed changes, Django would generate SQL statements specific to your database backend. So these statements are then executed sequentially against your database, applying the intended modifications to your schema. Okay, so now the changes have been created in your database. So after successfully applying the migrations, Django will then mark them as applied in the internal tracking system. So the database table I mentioned. So this will prevent them from being executed again unnecessarily, of course. Now, through this process, if any time an error occurs during the migration process, then Django will stop and roll back any completed changes. So it does provide error message to help you identify the fix and problem before retrying the migration. If we take a look at the help text for the migrate command, we can see that there's quite a few different options for the migrate command. There are some very useful and powerful options here. Most notably the fake initial options. And we'll take a look at some of these more useful commands at a later point in this module individually. It'd be well worth reading through some of the other trivial options that are available. They may come in use at some point within your development process. Now that we have an underpinning knowledge of the Django migration command, we can now go ahead and explore some of the more advanced options. Before we do that, I will introduce you to the make migration table in the Django database, and then we'll take a look at using migrate with fake. That will lead us nicely into an exercise based upon an 8-year-old Django open ticket.